In 2010, Florida endured a so-called extreme freeze event that brought extremely cold temperatures into a region that typically enjoys warm, humid weather. The plant and animal life in Florida has not really evolved to handle such cold weather, and many species suffered immensely in the bitter cold. One of these species that suffered is an invasive population of Burmese pythons. These large snakes descend from southeastern Asia, where temperatures are almost universally warm and the climate tropical or subtropical. The invasive species in Florida is already in a significantly different environment, as Florida does experience a seasonal cooling during the winter, which isn't as pronounced in Southeast Asia. Freeze events in Florida have happened before, and so the native species here, while they don't really like the cold, they aren't taken totally by surprise. They aren't totally wiped out. But for snakes and other reptiles and other cold-intolerant animals, the freeze events can be really deadly. The Burmese python species in particular experienced extreme selective pressure during this deep freeze event in 2010. Researchers at the University of Texas at Arlington wanted to track the magnitude of this selective pressure on the Burmese pythons, so they gathered genetic data on the pythons before the freeze event, and then they went and took field samples to generate more genetic data from after the freeze event. They used a genome scan to identify, quote, regions of the genome that appear to be under strong natural selection, which could contain genes important in adaptation that may have allowed a subset of this population to survive these freeze events, unquote. I'm quoting the biology professor Todd Casteau, the director of the Casteau Lab at the University of Texas. Now, what Todd Casteau and his research team found was much more than they expected. Darren Card is a graduate student working in the Casteau Lab, and he said, quote, we kept seeing evidence of adaptation in genes related to cell division, organ growth, and tissue development, which admittedly puzzled us at first, unquote. They were puzzled because they were expecting to see genetic changes that just made the snakes more tolerant of the cold, but instead they saw all of this stuff related to cell division and growth and development. But then they made the connection to the cyclical patterns of stasis and growth that correspond to the fasting and feeding cycles in the pythons. So using these new clues, they started looking into the Burmese pythons' feeding habits in their new Florida habitats. Darren Card described their results, saying, quote, these additional analyses showed that Burmese pythons in Florida are constantly feeding, and the tissue morphological and gene expression patterns support a more upregulated physiological state in fasted pythons. Florida pythons appear to have adapted to regulating their digestive physiology to more efficiently eat prey constantly. This is alarming because these snakes have already been shown to have major negative impacts on endemic mammalian and bird populations in South Florida, including Everglades National Park, and our data was suggesting that through rapid adaptation, they are only getting better at being an effective invasive predator, unquote. So, to paraphrase, this invasive Burmese python population is doing much more than just adapting to the cold. Not only are they becoming more cold tolerant, their entire metabolism is becoming more endothermic. The pythons are eating more and more often, and their body tissues are becoming metabolically active, generating more heat and more cellular activity than their more exothermic cousins back in Southeast Asia. In this sense, their metabolism is becoming more like an endothermic mammal and less like an exothermic reptile. So the pythons aren't just becoming resistant to the cold, it's not that simple. The immense selection pressure of these freezing events is radically shifting their entire metabolism, their feeding strategies, and their growth patterns. The chair of the biology department at the University of Texas at Arlington is Mr. Clay Clark, and he congratulated the research team and described their findings by saying, quote, these results provide an unprecedented perspective at how quickly a vertebrate population can evolve, while also providing new links between genomic adaptation and complex physiological change related to the ecological impacts of invasive species. Unquote.